The hospital room was small and cramped. My leg was painful, but I didn't really pay it any mind. I had much bigger things to think about. I hadn't seen Joe in months, not since the day I had left. I had barely muttered a goodbye, saying that I needed to be alone for a while. Well, it had certainly been a while. Several months, actually. But now here he was, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair next to me, sorting through some suspiciously scorched papers in the rays of the midday sun. He barely looked changed since I had last seen him, but then again, it hadn't been that long, not in the grand scheme of things. Perhaps more tired, but that was it. Oh, and one other thing. His eyes. They had a deep, sunken look in them, as though he had just gotten back from some terrible war where he had watched his comrades die in his arms. He was staring at the papers, but I had doubts he had absorbed a single word from them. Just shuffling them, one after the other, thoughts a million miles away. It was a look I recognized. I had seen it in the mirror every day since I had lost him. It was a look that said, "What do I do now?" And to be honest, I didn't really know. I looked out the small window that was next to my bed, looking at the sunshine-filled street. It was hard to believe that only about a day ago, I was running for my life in the woods away from, for lack of a better term, monsters. It almost seemed like a bad dream now, but the pain in my leg from where that thing had dug into me gave me a sharp reminder that it had been very real. "Hey," Joe said suddenly, startling me. When I had woken up after falling asleep in the hospital, exhausted from the events of the previous night, he had been there, sleeping in the chair next to me. He looked about as tired as I had felt, so I had let him sleep until he finally woke up around noon. There had been no teary hellos or anything like that. He had simply grabbed the papers from his briefcase next to him and started looking over them. Maybe I should have thought it was rude, but honestly, I was glad. I had also needed the extra time to marshal my thoughts and process everything that had happened. But it seemed he was finally ready to talk. "When I first got here, you were muttering in your sleep. Something about a cat. Do you have one now?" he asked. The question caught me a little off guard, but then I gave a slight laugh. Out of everything he wanted to know, that was his most pressing concern? "Yeah, I do. A fluffy white thing. Its name is Casper." He nodded thoughtfully, staring out the window. Then, without even turning to look at me, continued. "Is it all right? You sounded pretty worried in your sleep." I nodded. "Yeah, he's at the vet now. He was pretty banged up, but he should be okay." Now it was his turn to nod. "I didn't realize you were a cat person," he said, not addressing the fact that the cat was at the vet. "We would wrap around to it, I suppose." "I found him not long after I retired. Just wandering around in my backyard, a stray. I fed him, and eventually he invited himself into my home. I didn't mention the hours I spent just sitting in the yard, staring out into the forest, not thinking about anything at all. That stray tomcat coming up to me was the only thing that broke the monotony. I was surprised at first, but eventually just accepted it." "I see," Joe said, seeming to be deep in thought. Finally, after staring out the window for another long few seconds, he turned back to me. "So, what happened to your leg?" he said, unexpectedly changing the conversation. But a fair question. I told him everything. About the basement, the cat being taken, the things in the woods, even the meat tree things. I knew that he knew I was telling the truth, and that I wasn't delusional or insane. Perhaps another might have thought that I had lost my mind, but not Joe. Not with me. We had known each other for too long at this point, and he knew that I wasn't the type to go making fantastical stories. The only thing I left out was my mental state, both then and now. I knew that he had to have some idea of what I was going through, but I didn't want to bring up just how bad it was right now, and it didn't feel relevant at this particular moment. Plus, it was personal, and talking about it out loud would make it so much more real than it had already been. Despite my trust in Joe, I had expected at least a raised eyebrow in response to this story, if not for believing me, then in the insane nature of the story itself. But instead, he simply nodded along, with no real change in his face other than somehow managing to look even more tired than he had already been, despite just waking up. I'm surprised, Joe. That was a pretty crazy tale I just told, and you barely seemed shocked. I'm guessing you have a story of your own to tell? He gave a slight huff of laughter and nodded his head slowly. If you can believe it, Mary, I don't think my story is all that different from yours. He took a deep sigh and began. He told me of the little boy and his mother who had gone missing. When he mentioned the agency's struggling finances and how he took the job anyway, I looked away with something like shame burning on my face. But if he noticed it, he gave no indication. He talked of the woman's shelter and the notes he found, the assailants in the basement, the pillar of flesh down there, and how it consumed one of his attackers whole, his escape in the fire. Finally, he finished off the story by holding up the burnt papers, the ones he had been shuffling around. This was what I wanted to show you. He handed them to me, and I could see that they were covered in fairly large text, as though the author was trying to make it as easy to read as possible. But before I read it, before I really got into it, I had something I had to say. Joe. I paused for a second, unsure of how to proceed. He just looked at me, heavy bags under his eyes, but expression otherwise unreadable. I'm sorry I left without saying anything. That wasn't fair of me, or right. You deserve to know why I was leaving, where I was going. Are you going to tell me that now? He asked, face inscrutable. I looked at him, inside myself. I felt that red, raw wound of what I had lost, that seemed to have not faded at all, even with all the time that had passed. I thought of the long, lonely nights sitting in the dark, staring at the flickering TV screen, of my parents, of my child. I could feel their ghosts calling out to me, asking of me something, but I couldn't quite make out what. I was not a superstitious person, but I could almost hear them. I didn't know what they were saying, but I fear that they were asking me to join them. No, I don't think I am ready for that. I'm sorry, Joe, but I just can't. It's too raw. I looked up at him, and he gave me a small nod of understanding. I was appreciative of that, and I felt like I couldn't just leave it on that, so I quickly blurted out a different ending. Soon, though, when the time is right, and we don't have... I gestured to the papers. Whatever this is going on. He smiled slightly, the Joe I know peeking out just a little, and he stuck out his hand for a handshake, which I gave him in full. Apology accepted, and deal. When you are ready. Besides, it's not like I am completely absolved of blame. I could have reached out, tried to contact you. Don't worry about it, I responded. I wouldn't have returned your calls anyway. He laughed at that, and it was a nice noise, but it quickly faded in the stark hospital room. An awkward moment of silence, and I finally turned my attention to the papers that he had given me. I was careful with them, as they felt as though they would fall apart with even the lightest of touches. And indeed, when my finger brushed against one of the charred edges, soot smeared off on my hand, leaving a black mark on it that I quickly wiped off onto the bed. So, these are the papers, huh? You went through a lot for them. Have you read over them already? He gave a small shrug in response. Only skimmed them. I was dead tired, so I barely understood what I was reading anyway. Mind scooting over a bit so I can read over your shoulder? I made the necessary adjustments, holding the papers at a somewhat awkward angle so that we could both see it, and then, in that stark white, sun-filled room, we began to read. There was no introduction or title. The paper simply began.
There is an ancient myth that states this. When humans first appeared on this earth, they did not look like how we look today. They were quite different, having 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. These humans were powerful, and they could achieve many incredible things. In fact, these humans were so strong that they threatened the very gods, who, in fear of what the humans may do, devised a plan. They split the humans in 2, separating them so that they only had 2 of each limb and a single face. The humans, however, knew that this was not right, and thus were doomed to spend the rest of their lives searching for their other half, so that they may be complete once more. This is, of course, just a myth, a simple explanation for why we feel love and the eternal search for our mate. But there lies inside of this story an idea of unity, of humans being stronger together than they are apart. And of course this is true. A pair is stronger than just one, a group stronger than that, and a community stronger still. But we are cursed to endlessly squabble and argue, always drawing more lines to divide us and keep us from reaching our fullest potential. It is for that reason that I originally created our small organization, in hopes that it would eventually bring people together. And, for the most part, we have succeeded in this endeavor. However, as we have continued to grow, issues have begun to present themselves in increasing volume.
Me and Joe exchanged a look on that line, but continued to read onwards anyway.
There are people that are being selfish, taking our resources for their own gain. There are others that are meek and are unwilling to carry out the tasks that were assigned to them. And worst of all, there are those that abandon us in our time of need. These people are traitors, and deserve all of the humiliation and scorn that comes with being so. But do not worry. Despite what those who leave us may think, they will get what is coming to them. In time. Rest assured, they will get their just deserts.
Pretty intense for what seems to be a group-wide letter, Joe muttered under his breath, and I found myself inclined to agree. Whatever this group was, they did not take kindly to people leaving.
But enough of that negative talk. Let me tell you of something positive. Our organization has now reached over 1,000 members, marking a very impressive milestone for us all. I would just like to say, congratulations. I welcome all of you newcomers with open arms. I know that some of you may be unsure of what sorts of rules we have in place and how we run this little operation. Below, I have taken the liberty of listing out those very things. Follow these, and we will all get along just fine.
Underneath that paragraph was, indeed, a list of rules, laid out in a bullet point format. Most of them seemed fairly self-explanatory, such as not taking from the donations bin or being honest, although I had to wonder if these rules were strictly necessary to list out. However, some other ones stood out, such as you must visit the ocean at least once a month, and sacrifice is important. Joe squinted his eyes, clearly going through the same thought process as me. I don't even think that's a rule. It's just a statement, I said, pointing at the sacrifice one. He nodded, frowning. So this is a religious organization of some sort? It seems to be that, with the mention of donations and the way these rules are listed, he said, brow furrowing. Seems more like a cult to me. I wish we had a name, but perhaps it will present itself. 1,000 members isn't a ton in the grand scheme of things, but still, perhaps one of us would have heard of them. Joe's lips grew tight. I would hazard a guess that they might be local. Like you said, 1,000 is small, and I bet these papers didn't travel very far. They might even be in this very city. But that's just speculation. Let's continue to read. I nodded, but as we prepared to resume, a thump came from outside. We both looked at each other, and Joe got up to peek out the window as I strained to see from my position in the hospital bed. "What is it?" I asked, and he didn't respond for a long second. "Nothing. There's nothing out there. Just an empty parking lot." He glanced back at me, eyebrows furrowed, then back out the window. I got no idea what did that. Probably a bird or something hitting the window. That made the most logical sense, and I wanted to agree with it. But after the night that both of us had had, I don't think either of us truly believed it. But still, Joe came and sat back down next to me, and we continued to read the somewhat scorched pages.
You have actually joined at an excellent time. We will soon begin to enter into the next phase of our process, which, while I cannot reveal to you right now what that phase consists of, I assure you will bring us all closer together as comrades in arms. I can understand if you have any questions, but I assure you they will be.
The text was cut off here from a scorch mark that ran down the entire length of the page, making it difficult to discern what the words even were, much less if they were important or not. I cursed, flipping over the sheet to see that it never had anything on the other side of it to begin with. I moved on to the next page to find it similarly desolate, only able to make out a few useless words here and there. Frustrated, I moved on to the next page, which thankfully had at least a couple of readable paragraphs.
While I must humbly accept the praise that I have received for the work I have done on Project G, I must also thank the ever-illustrious Dr. Saul for his contributions to the project, and I hope that I will be able to see him in the flesh shortly after releasing this letter, so that I may say my praises to him directly.
I pointed that out to Joe, excited to finally have any sort of lead. You see that? A name. Dr. Saul. Do you know any doctors that go by that? Joe shook his head, deep in thought. No, but it's important to remember that he could very well be a doctor of something other than medicine, and thus would be less visible to the public eye. He reached over and took the page out of my hand gently, getting a closer look at it, as though he was having trouble seeing the words upon it. Project G. I remember that name. I read it on the first sheet of paper that I found on Ruth's desk. There was mention of it, and it proceeding accordingly. There was also some mention of animals or something, but I'm not sure. I got hit on the head right after reading it, so it's a little fuzzy. I do know this, though. The paper that I read that on isn't in this pile we have here, so I have to assume it burned up in the fire. He swore at that. Shit. That seemed useful. He chewed on his bottom lip, and I reached over to put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Hey, no point in beating yourself up over it. It's a miracle that you were able to get these that we have now in the first place. Besides, it's not like all is lost. We haven't even finished reading what we have. He nodded at that, and for a moment I was struck by the strangeness of me comforting him while I laid in a hospital bed. I didn't blame him, of course. It was really down to luck and nothing else that I got injured while he made it out relatively unscathed. I think it more was due to the fact that for so long it had been just me sitting at home alone, or stocking the shelves of some shitty convenience store by myself and stewing in my thoughts, which had led me to become used to the negativity of it, almost complacent. I had thought very little about my own emotional state, and it was only now, seeing the upset expression that I knew I had been wearing for days on end reflected back at me, is what finally caused me to really start to think about what had happened. I had been wallowing in my feelings for so long that I barely had even taken the time to process them. But it seems, ironically, that I still did not have time for this sort of deep introspection, as Joe had started to read again, and I didn't want to be left behind. I knew that I would have to return to this thought, however, as it felt deeply important. Not something to be discarded, but simply set aside for now until a later date.
In the meantime, I myself will be here, in the city, at least for a while to help oversee some of the final few steps in the process. I know that some of you may be excited to meet the leader of this wonderful new group that you have joined, and that is why I am happy to say that you may meet with me for the following days at this location.
Unfortunately, where there had been an address previously, there was now only the black edges of a burn hole in the paper and the faint smell of smoke. Typical, I muttered, moving on to the next paragraph as Joe gave an affirming, if frustrated noise. I noted that there was only a couple of paragraphs left, and so resumed reading with renewed vigor, hoping to squeeze out any information that I could with what remained.
I assure you, after I leave the city and return to my home, you will begin to see the impact that we have had not only on this city, but the world as a whole. No longer will we be the halved monsters running around in the mud, but rather we will build towers that stretch up to the sky, so high that perhaps even the gods will take notice. I leave you with this, a word of advice as we head forward into these exciting new times. Things may seem strange at first, perhaps even frightening, but once we make the leap into our new ways of living and integrate not only the American public, but the entire world, you will see that life will be easier, simpler, happier. I look forward to seeing you all on the other side.
A handwritten signature was on the bottom, simple but elegant. The flames had seared it, but it was still very much legible.
Eve.